Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. I completed my clinical pastoral residency at Mary Washington Hospital in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and I then went on to work for a medical hospice agency in Indianapolis, Indiana. When my husband, who happens to also be a pastor, moved to Indiana for his church residency, which lasted for 2 years. So I was driving within a 30-mile radius of Indianapolis, visiting individuals at end of life and supporting their families as well as our staff along the way. Most of my days are spent working with individuals who are facing their last phases of life or working with their surviving loved ones. And I wanted to begin today by saying that I have not directly had an NDE, a near-death experience. However, by working with individuals in hospital and critical care settings and at end of life, I feel that I've experienced them indirectly, vicariously, so to speak, through patients and families that I have encountered. And I've had some unique experiences that I believe confirm my belief in a realm beyond and affirm the need for sensitivity when working with individuals who report such experiences as well. And I wanted to begin today by reading a passage from one of my all-time favorite books. This is On Living by Carrie Egan. Egan is a hospice chaplain who graduated from Harvard Divinity, and she has some profoundly beautiful words and stories in her book. I would encourage you all to pick up a copy at some point or another if you haven't. There's just some wonderful tales about what it means to live in the now, and also what it means to support those who are at end of life and their loved ones as well. And I want to begin before reading by saying that, to preface this, Egan talks frequently throughout her book about her experience with postpartum psychosis. When she had her first child, she was given an anesthesia, which caused psychosis in her body. And it left her riddled, unable to hold her child, to care for her child for a number of months. So she begins by talking about this, but I think it speaks so succinctly to the needs of all of us here today. So if you would entertain me, listen for a moment. She says, "When I was sick, the question of what was real and what was not real was all I could think about. Were my ketamine-fueled hallucinations of astral journeys real? After all, many indigenous tribes use psychotropic drugs to induce astral journeys, and the wisdom gained during those hallucinations is not just prized, but believed to have a reality greater than the reality we generally inhabit. Thousands of years of Christian tradition have held mystical visions to be not only real, but more real than this world, in which we see through a glass darkly. What I thought God was during my hallucinations insisted that it was the only thing that was real, and that it was this mundane real world that was an illusion. Anyone who has studied Eastern religions in even a cursory way is familiar with that idea. The belief in a reality beyond the reality we see and touch every day is a foundational idea of many belief systems. But every single person I spoke to about the ketamine hallucinations told me they were not real. They were not a real religious experience. That was not a real encounter with God. There was no reality to them, and therefore no value. When I was psychotic, I was absolutely convinced that the baby I'd been pregnant with had died, and I grieved as though I had had a stillbirth. In objective fact, my baby was alive and gurgling on my lap, but the nature of psychosis is such that a chubby, living, and breathing infant is no refutation to a delusion. I sat on my couch and sobbed for hours, for months, over a dead baby. But while the grief was searing, debilitating, all-encompassing, no one would acknowledge it was real. I felt the most alone I have ever felt with my secret, deluded, inconsolable grief. And a year after my son was born, after I'd been on antipsychotics for about 6 months, a friend invited me to a luncheon gathering. I didn't know anyone else who was going, so my friend sat me next to her sister, a psychologist. we got into a conversation, and I told the sister that I had been diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. She was very sympathetic and kind until I explained that the psychosis had been caused by a drug. Oh, so you don't have real postpartum psychosis. My patients with real postpartum psychosis suffer so much, but yours isn't real. It was a harsher echo of what so many loving friends had said to me when I told them about what I had thought, said, and done while I was psychotic. That wasn't really you. But if it wasn't me, who was it? If it wasn't the real me, where had the real me gone? When your ability to determine what is real is taken away by a drug, it's terrifying. But it's far worse when it's denied to you by other people. Over the years of listening to people's stories, I've learned that many, many people, maybe even most people, will experience in their lifetime things that challenge their sense of what is real or possible. 3 sisters ask their mother for a sign that she's okay after she dies. Each of them, separated by thousands of miles, opens up her mailbox the next day after her death, and a butterfly flies out. A young man wakes up from surgery to find St. Gerard sitting next to him. He has no connection to St. Gerard, has never even heard of him before. He's told that it's an after effect of the anesthesia. But over the next 6 months until he dies, despite having no other neurological or psychiatric complications, St. Gerard never leaves him. On a sunny day, 3 Pentecostal women pray over the husband of one of them. Just as the prayer reaches its crescendo, an enormous clap of thunder rattles the windows, and the wife faints. The TV weatherman that night cheerfully reports an unusual weather occurrence that day, a bolt from the blue. Each of these incidences happened to people I knew. Anyone who works in hospice could tell you similar stories. They happen to many people, whether we embrace them or refuse to think about them, whether we are comforted or terrified by them. True, such experiences can be explained by coincidence, by medicine, by meteorology, but the people who experience them felt something more than coincidence. When we dismiss an experience as not real, what we are actually rejecting is the person's attempt at making meaning of the experience. That's a cruel thing to do. Attempting to find or make meaning is perhaps the central task of the spiritual life. The single most helpful question anyone could have asked me when I was sick would have been, what does the experience you had on ketamine mean to you? Nobody ever asked me that. It was dismissed as not real, and therefore the meaning was not worth exploring. How much more helpful, kind, and enlightening it is to ask what the meaning of angels, the butterflies, the thunder, and the hallucination is. Well, like Carrie Egan, I have had loved ones closest to me describe instances in which their realities, their experiences with near death, their situations have been quickly dismissed by others. And the first near-death experience I remember hearing was actually from my grandmother, Elizabeth Richards. When I was a high school teenager, I'd come across a story in a live television show about a man who was relaying a near-death experience after being in a car accident. And I remember sitting on my grandmother's bed watching the show with her when she turned down the volume on the TV and she began to share her story with me. She said she was 9 years old and living in Wilmington, North Carolina at the time in her hometown, and she'd been experiencing chronic throat infections, and it was determined by her doctor that it would be best for her to have her tonsils removed. On the day of the procedure, she was given an anesthetic, and she remembered feeling reassured by the staff around her at the time. But immediately following the clip of the tonsils and the procedure, my grandmother began hemorrhaging, and the medical team had to rush to save her life. My grandmother says that she vividly remembered floating up out of her body over the operating room, looking down at herself over the table with the doctors and the nurses scrambling below and attempting to save her. And she remembered the doctor shouting, "She's hemorrhaging." And she remembered feeling this profound sense of peace as well. She remembered a warmth surrounding her body, even though she could see herself there on a cold operating table. And she remembered a voice from behind her saying, "I love you." The next moment she could recall was waking up and finding her mother and her brother standing over her saying her name, "Elizabeth. Elizabeth, we're here." And over the next few weeks, my grandmother, still a young child, recovered from her surgery and then attempted to tell her mother, my great-grandmother, what happened to her in that room on that operating table that day. And my great-grandmother, whom we dubbed Sissy, was a traditionalist through and through. Sissy did not have patience for things like forgetting your manners or not pressing your dress, and she certainly felt that saving face was much better than speaking about and displaying one's emotions. So when presented with this story from my grandmother, my great-grandmother's first reaction to my grandmother was to tell her to never speak of it again. It was probably the anesthesia. And the one thing that I remember as a teenager and listening to this story from my grandmother is the pain that I saw in her face and heard in her voice when she told me her mother's response. Rather than inviting my grandmother to share this experience and to sit with her in wonder and with comfort, my great-grandmother, she dismissed it as not real, as inappropriate. And I couldn't help but wondering if my great-grandmother had missed out on something really special that day, because I got to marvel with my grandmother over her experience. And I got to hug her, and I got to tell her that I loved her. My grandmother's near-death story has resurfaced for me so many times throughout my life, and particularly in my work as a hospital chaplain and as a hospice chaplain. One of the steps that's required for any chaplain seeking board certification is to complete a clinical residency program through the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. This is a very rigorous program. It's usually based in a hospital or another kind of clinical environment in which young seminary graduates are thrown into the clinical setting and told, go. It's often called Immersion Learning. Chaplain residents are assigned to a particular site of the hospital and are instructed to round on a regular basis, just as doctors and other teams do. And as they round, they are expected to spiritually and emotionally care for patients, family, and staff who work on their units. And then after rounding, residents report back to their peer group and supervisors about their encounters through these things called verbatims, and then we do things also called didactics, teaching moments. I equate the clinical training with a lot of group therapy, self-examination, and professional refinement. And during my clinical residency, I was assigned to the intensive care unit at Mary Washington Hospital in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The unit consisted of 32 beds, 16 of which made up the medical ICU, and another 16 of which made up the surgical ICU. The surgical ICU was a step-down unit to the trauma room. Any individual entering the hospital requiring immediate surgery related to a trauma injury would be moved to the surgical ICU for monitoring. Oftentimes, I'd be on call during the daytime and even the evenings, and I was expected to respond to anything in the hospital, including whatever might be transpiring in that good old emergency room. And I remember very clearly one evening responding to a trauma call in the emergency room for a car accident just off of Interstate 95, the main thoroughfare through Fredericksburg. A mother in her 50s and a daughter, 19 years old, had been driving down the highway, headed to their hometown in Florida after visiting family in New England. They were attempting to drive through the night so that both could get back to work within 2 days' time. The mother was driving the vehicle when she fell asleep behind the wheel, overcorrected, and rolled the car off the interstate. The daughter, at the time, was asleep in the back seat, stretched out, without her seatbelt on. It took emergency responders over 10 minutes after getting to the scene to realize that there was more than one individual in the vehicle. And when the car rolled, luggage and other miscellaneous items from the back covered the daughter on the floorboard of the car, and the EMTs found her unresponsive. CPR was performed at the scene, and she was immediately hooked up to a respirator and rushed into the trauma room. I was standing in the trauma room waiting with the team when she was rolled in on the gurney. And I noticed immediately that she was young. And I remember feeling devastated as I heard from the team that it had been a full 10 minutes before she'd been discovered and pulled from the car. And with the team, I noticed the beauty that this woman radiated. She had delicately painted fingernails and toenails that sparkled in that fluorescent light in the trauma room. Her hair had been elegantly highlighted blonde and pulled back into a long ponytail that extended way beyond her shoulders. And visibly, she carried the tone of a runner or an athlete of some kind. Her skin was a deep, deep tan, radiating the rays of many days spent in the Florida sunshine. And usually what happens in a trauma situation is that when a patient arrives to the hospital, a team of specialists descend to rapidly assess and document and execute the medical needs of the patient at hand. There can be as many as 15 people standing in a room, waiting for their turn to process, usually guided by the direction of a trauma physician. This includes phlebotomists, x-ray technicians, ED nurses, scribes, and sometimes even medical residents in training. The patient's clothes are cut from the body, and an easily maneuverable medical sheet is placed over the body to help with the assessment and placement of lifelines. It was about the time that this particular patient's clothes were cut off that I began overhearing comments from some of the phlebotomists and technicians standing at my side in the corner of the room. One of them said crassly, "Well, somebody's been out of the sun." And then another piped up, "Yeah, I think I need some sunglasses from the glare." My grandmother's story came rushing back to me. I remembered how she had talked about how she could see and hear everything happening in that operating room when her life hanged on the line. She was above, looking down, observing. And then in that moment, this chaplain got angry. I said to the two technicians, "Enough!" very loudly, enough so to turn the head of the trauma physician. I continued, it is not appropriate to be saying these things about this young woman's body. Her heart is beating, and she can still hear you. Now, the technicians, they're rather caught off guard by this young chaplain standing in the corner and kind of look sheepishly at one another. But then the trauma physician, who happened to have a very deep respect for chaplains and a Navy background, piped up, "Listen to the chaplain. Get out if you can't be professional." And then she immediately turned back to her work. I realized that what happened in that trauma room that day was something that happened regularly among trauma teams. Dark humor is often a coping mechanism of those exposed to disturbing events on a regular basis. It's an attempt to detach, to disassociate, especially in dire circumstances. But knowing what I know now, after working as a hospice chaplain for 5 years, namely that studies show that people hear until they take their last breaths, I know that detaching in these kinds of ways through crude conversation strips patients of their dignity and their right to peace. And part of my role as a chaplain is to teach clinical team members about this key element in preserving dignity and giving them other spaces in which to process that sometimes traumatic encounters with life and death. I will say that I worked very hard that year with my trauma team and my ICU nurses to encourage spaces in which they could do so. Spaces for prayer, spaces for meditation, spaces for holistic care, like massage, and even exercise. But I digress. In returning to that story of that mother and her daughter, I spent most of the evening with that mother. She'd suffered a mild concussion during the accident and originally presented to the ER dazed, shocked, and confused. I kept her company while her daughter was in surgery, working with the nurses to try and keep her awake for a period of time after that concussion. And I also called in a priest per her request, as she was Catholic, and I listened as she spoke of her daughter's love for people, her passion for the beauty industry, her vitality, and her love for animals, and her new boyfriend. I followed her up to the hospital room where she was eventually given some pain medication for her bruised body and something to help her sleep. And I was reunited with her just as the sun rose the next day when that same trauma physician called me in as she delivered the news to the mother. The girl's spleen had ruptured. The internal bleeding could not be completely stopped. And the trauma from the lack of oxygen in the brain for such a lengthy period of time had caused permanent and irreversible damage. So I accompanied the mother as she was wheeled into that ICU to see her daughter for the last time. I held her hand as she stroked her daughter's beautiful blonde hair, kissed her forehead, and told her that she would love her forever and always. She sobbed and wailed for several minutes. And as she stroked her daughter's face, she turned to me and said through sniffles, "I had a dream upstairs in the room." She was waving at me and telling me, "I love you, Mom." "I bet you think that's crazy," she said with a little chuckle under her breath, holding a tissue to her face. "No, I think that's beautiful," I said. "Thank you for sharing that with me." And then she left the room, giving me a hug, and her daughter one last arm-around embrace, tears streaming down her face. My work in the hospital was filled with these kinds of sacred encounters with individuals nearing death, and experiences that even sometimes their loved ones would relate to me of visions and dreams. I can remember several instances experiences in which I spoke with individuals on the step-down floor from the ICU who could recall hearing voices of loved ones that had gone before them, seeing light, feeling warmth, and oftentimes questioning why they had survived. And part of my role as a chaplain is helping patients to unpack this question of purpose, this question of why. Many individuals, after surviving such harrowing experiences, begin laying out the blueprints of how they wish to live their lives. For some, being able to talk about the future felt miraculous. I can remember one gentleman who survived a severe motorcycle accident who vowed to leave his draining job and also to tell his wife on a daily basis that he loved her. Near-death experiences produce meaning-making questions for both the survivors and those who love them. And these questions, I think, are often gifts to those like me who get to listen to them, because they invite me, as a clinical practitioner, to think more deeply about how I want to live. And they also give me an opportunity to marvel upon the sacred mysteries of life. Well, immediately following that clinical pastoral residency that I did, I moved to Indianapolis with my husband, as I mentioned. I was there for 2 years. And while in Indy, I could not find an open church or hospital position, but I was able to find work with a medical hospice agency. It was on the west side of Indianapolis. And looking back on it, this was a perfect transition from working in the ICU, in which death and near-death occurs on a regular basis. The one element that changed in the equation was that the patients that I was visiting with, well, I often got to know them through their own voices. Many were awake, alert, and oriented when admitted to our care. They were not attached to life-sustaining machines. They were receiving treatment for pain, but they were no longer pursuing curative treatment. And one of the greatest learning moments for me was through one of my patients, whom I will call Liza. Liza was a retired administrative assistant who had been living in a skilled nursing facility for several months, as she could no longer take care of herself at home. She had early dementia, COPD, and a recent diagnosis of lung cancer. I would visit with Liza just about every other week in her room on the east side of Indianapolis, and she would tell me about her late husband, whom I will call Antonio. They had met in New York City, and he had wooed her by taking her out to dinner and to the opera. He had died about 10 years prior of cancer, and her health began deteriorating not long after. They had a daughter, whom I will call Sarah, who lived in Indianapolis and who would drop by about once a week to visit her mother in the nursing center. Liza loved cookies, especially Girl Scout Thin Mints. She always had a stash in her room and would offer me one every time I visited. And she also really loved company, as she was a talker. She liked telling stories about growing up in old New York, though this became harder for her, especially as her disease progressed, as COPD so often affects the lungs. The one thing Liza hated was being alone. She would become childlike when I went to exit from our visit, saying, "Oh, please, don't leave yet," or "Do come back soon, dear. I just can't get along without anyone." And the staff, well, they gave her a roommate in the early days of her arrival to keep her company, but this roommate often slept. I found that reciting the rosary with her before leaving was often soothing for her, And I would always make a point of sending a staff member in when I left to check on her, get her comfortable, and reassure her that people were around her. One day, I walked in to find Liza unresponsive. Her breathing had become heavier and had changed in timing. She would not wake up to talk. Her skin had a paleness to it, and she was perspiring from her forehead. When checking in with her floor nurse, I learned that this had been her pattern for the last day and a half. It was the end of the day, around 5:00 p.m., when I visited Liza. And I called Sarah, her daughter, to come in. I told her that I'd consulted with our hospice nurse and that it was advised that she should come now if she wished. Liza probably didn't have much longer. And I knew from her personality that she did not want to be left alone. I sat with Liza for about 35 minutes before Sarah arrived, talking to her, thanking her for her stories and her cookies. I read scripture passages to her. And when Sarah arrived, we both joined Liza at the bedside, and at Sarah's request, we found an Italian opera station on Pandora and played some of Liza's favorite pieces, mainly by Pavarotti. We recited the rosary together over Liza. And with encouragement, Sarah spoke to her mother, reassuring her that she was there for her, thanking her mother for everything her mother had taught her, telling Liza that she loved her and that it was okay to go. And Sarah and I watched as Liza, upon taking her last breath, squinted open her eyes, beamed into the widest smile, almost radiating with light inside her last breath. I remember how my arms lined with goosebumps as Sarah told me that she was convinced that Liza saw Sarah's father, Antonio. And as she saw it, only he could have produced such a smile. I do not know what Liza saw that day, what produced that beautiful smile, but I do believe that Sarah knew her mother best, and that Sarah was probably right on the mark. Patients like Liza and family members like Sarah, by inviting me into these moments, have taught me that death is not something to be feared, and that in fact, it can be profoundly beautiful. I see patients at hospice house on a daily basis who tell me about seeing of loved ones gone before them in the room. I've heard individuals, and even my own grandmother, cry out to loved ones who have gone before them. As I learned from her over the years, her brother Snooky was very dear to her, and she called out to him in her last hours on her deathbed. He loved her unconditionally. Not only do I see patients at end of life who tell me about seeing their loved ones, but I also see many who cannot speak, but who sit, actively reaching out in front of them, extending their arms as if attempting to grasp or embrace something beyond. I see patients who wait until their long estranged loved ones arrive to take their last breath. And I see patients who wait until everyone has left the room to finish out their journeys. It is my firm belief that individuals encountering death are acutely aware of their surroundings, and that they can hear until they take their last breath, and that they have beautiful gifts to offer us in these final moments. They provide us moments of teaching how to live and to live fully. So too do you. as individuals who carry with you near-death experiences. You have stories that allow you to teach others the significance of meaning-making. You carry with you narratives that can provide profound comfort to people dealing with death anxieties. And you have a gift in sharing your stories to invite people to live more fully in the now, to teach them the way, and to show others what it means to live and love abundantly. May your stories continue to inform and transform all who you meet. May you be teachers about living in the now. And may the world be made more beautiful